Crosswind, Colorado Territory, 1879. The sun was sliding down like a worn coin, turning the dust to brass and the air to fire. The auction yard was crowded, the kind of crowd that smells of sweat and want. A woman stood on the wooden platform, hands bound with twine, hair loosened by the wind that never stopped blowing here. Her name was Clara Whitlow, daughter of a school teacher gone to debt and dust. Somewhere behind the hush of voices, a hammer waited to fall. The banker, Harlan Pike, lifted his hat like a man blessing the condemned. "Debt of $500, he called, "and she's to be paid for in lawful coin, wife for the payer." Laughter spilled through the dry heat, sharp as broken glass. Clara did not bow her head. She'd bowed enough in her life. A flash of movement broke through the crowd. A tall man in a dark coat, skin the color of oiled walnut, hat pulled low. Malachi Reed. Folks whispered his name like a secret half-believed. He walked past every bidder, boots whispering through the dust, and set a small canvas pouch on the table. "I'll pay the debt," he said, voice calm as slow thunder, "and I'll pay it forever." The hammer froze mid-air. The banker squinted. "You mean to buy her, Reed?" Malachi's jaw tightened. "No," he said softly. "I mean to end the selling." The words rolled through the yard, soft and heavy, until no one laughed anymore. For a heartbeat, the world went still. A horse snorted. Wind stirred the hanging rope above the post. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Fear, yes, but also the faintest breath of relief, so thin she could hardly hold it. The banker counted the gold, eyes small and mean. "All debts cleared," he said at last. "Time 500 pounds. Malachi turned to Clara. "You can come with me, Miss Whitlow," he told her. "Work for your keep, have your own room, or I'll give you this money, and you go wherever you please." His voice carried no pity, only choice. Clara's lips trembled. Choice. Such a small word, and yet no one had ever offered it to her before. She looked at the crowd. Faces she'd known since childhood, now carved in scorn. Behind them, the sheriff looked away, pretending to study the dirt. The air tasted of iron and sun. "I'll go," she said, voice barely there. "With you." He nodded once, then lifted her suitcase himself. No grand gesture, just a quiet respect that made the laughter die completely. As they walked toward the wagon, a memory slid through her. Her father's coughing fits, the ledger open on his desk, ink smeared where she'd signed his name because his hand had already failed. She had used another name then, her mother's maiden one, C. Whitman. A lie written to save a dying man. The whip cracked, horses started forward. Behind them, the town began to scatter, restless now that mercy had spoiled the show. The last light burned low across the roofs, painting everything the color of old blood. Halfway down the street, Malachi spoke, not turning his head. "I know what it's like to be sold and not owned," he said quietly. The road out of Crosswind ran narrow between the hills, where the wind turned mean after sundown. The wagon creaked over ruts deep enough to swallow sound, and the smell of sage and dry pine followed them like ghosts. The sky above was a spill of cold stars, too many to name, and the moon hung pale as bone. Clara sat stiff beside Malachi, hands hidden in her shawl. Every jolt of the wheels rattled through her bones. The silence between them was heavy, but not unkind. It felt like space she could breathe in if she dared. He drove with a steady hand, eyes forward, as if he'd made this road 100 times and still didn't trust it. "Cold?" he asked at last. "I'm fine," she lied. He shrugged off his coat anyway, laid it over her knees. "You'll keep better if you're warm." The fabric still held the smell of smoke and horse leather. Something steady, something alive. She wanted to hand it back, to keep her distance the way decency demanded, but she didn't. The night was too big for pride. When they stopped by a stream gone low from drought, Malachi climbed down first, tied the reins to a post half buried in stone. "We'll rest here till morning." Clara followed, the ground cold beneath her shoes. He built a small fire with dry mesquite, and its glow painted the canyon walls red as old wounds. She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." He looked up from the fire, the light catching the lines of his face. Hard, weathered, but kind in a way that made her chest ache. "Didn't have to know you," he said. "I saw a person treated like a thing. That was enough." Clara wanted to speak, to tell him he'd made a mistake, that she wasn't worth the gold in his pouch, but the words turned to ash. In the crackle of the fire, she remembered Pike's breath against her ear. "You signed that paper as another woman." The memory struck like a stone to the ribs. She pulled the coat tighter, staring into the flame until her eyes burned. Somewhere far down the valley, a coyote cried, a sound that didn't belong to pain or joy, only to loneliness. Malachi rose, fed another stick to the fire. "Sleep if you can," he said. "We've a long ride come morning." She nodded, though sleep felt impossible. When he turned away to check the horses, Clara opened her small satchel. Between the folded dress and her father's worn Bible lay a single sheet of paper, the contract she had forged, C. Whitman, written in her own hand. The ink had faded, but the guilt never had. She folded it back, pressing it close as if the paper could feel her shame. The night stretched on, each sound sharpened by distance. The crack of the fire, the rustle of wind through rockweed, Malachi humming something soft and low under his breath, a tune with no words, like a prayer for no one to hear. When she woke near dawn, the fire was a faint red eye in the ash. Her breath clouded in the cold, and Malachi was already at the horses, his movements quiet and sure. The horizon had begun to silver, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't dread what morning might bring. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Not much, but it's warm." She smiled faintly. "That's enough." As they climbed back into the wagon, the first sun struck the ridge, light gold, pure and fleeting. Clara glanced once over her shoulder toward the road they'd left behind. The town was gone now, swallowed by the haze, but she could still feel it breathing on her neck. The debt, the shame, the man with the vulture eyes. Malachi flicked the reins, and the horses started up the incline. Dust rose in soft clouds behind them. Clara watched the road, twist out of sight. A knot tightening in her chest she couldn't yet name. Then she saw it. Far off on the next ridge, a glimmer of red. A campfire. Too still to be accident. Too near to be safe. Her breath caught. "Mr. Reed, there's—" "I see it," he said quietly, not slowing the horses. His jaw tightened, and for a moment his eyes looked darker than the dawn. "Keep your eyes ahead, Miss Whitlow. Some debts don't like being left behind." The wagon rolled on, the wheels whispering over stone, the sound of pursuit carried faintly on the wind. By late afternoon, the trail widened, spilling into a valley brushed gold by autumn grass. The mountains stood like tired giants at the edge of the world, and below them lay a stretch of land held together by fence wire and faith. Reed Homestead. Malachi slowed the horses, the wagon creaking as they passed through the open gate. The sign above it leaned a little, letters faded but proud. Clara's hands tightened on her shawl as she took in the sight. Weathered barn, split-rail corral, a porch with 2 chairs left to rock themselves in the wind. It wasn't much, but it breathed of work and care. 2 men came from the barn, wiping their hands on old bandanas. Santiago and Luis Ortega, Malachi called them. Brothers, both dark-eyed, both smiling in that easy way of men who knew hardship, but hadn't let it sour them. "You made it, patron," Santiago said, voice rolling smooth with the Spanish lilt. "And you brought company." "This here's Miss Whitlow," Malachi replied. "She'll be helping around the house." Luis tipped his hat. "Then the house is blessed again. Too long without a woman's touch." Clara managed a small nod, unsure whether to smile. No one here looked at her like she was a debt or a scandal. That alone felt strange enough to ache. They helped her down from the wagon. Her feet met solid earth. Her first step into a place not owned by fear. Malachi pointed to the porch. "You'll have your own room upstairs. Door locks from the inside." He said it like a promise. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and soap. Everything was plain but tended. Polished floors, curtains neatly mended, a few books stacked by the hearth. On the mantel stood a small wooden box, carved with delicate care. Malachi brushed a finger over it before setting it back, almost tenderly. "My mother's," he said quietly. "She used to say freedom needs a thing to remind you it's real." Clara said nothing, only felt the weight of that line settle deep inside her. From the kitchen came the scent of Mama Ortega's cooking. Cornbread, stew thick with herbs. Luis returned with a pot wrapped in cloth. "Mama sent this," he said. "Says no one should start a new life on an empty stomach." Clara nearly smiled again. Her throat, though, stayed tight. After supper, she helped wash the dishes. Malachi stood by the door, rolling a cigarette he didn't light. "You did fine today," he said. "I didn't do much. You came this far." Outside, the light was slipping away, painting the porch steps in long, soft lines. Clara watched him move with the ease of a man built for quiet work, his shoulders broad under the fading sun. He carried calm the way others carried weapons. When she went upstairs, the room waited clean and spare. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked toward the cottonwoods. Someone, Malachi, she guessed, had laid a quilt across the sheets. She touched the stitching, rough but careful. The sound of the wind outside changed, rising into a low moan. She pushed the window open a little. From here, the ranch stretched endless under the dusk. She thought she saw something flicker beyond the fence line. A brief glint, like a match struck in the dark. Probably nothing. Or maybe the fire from the ridge had found its way closer. She closed the window, fastened the latch. Downstairs, Malachi's voice drifted faintly through the floorboards, talking with the Ortega brothers about fence wire and winter hay. It was a good sound. Ordinary, steady, almost enough to drown the pulse still loud in her ears. She sat at the desk and unfolded the small handkerchief that held her mother's locket. Inside was a curl of faded hair, a scrap of old paper that read, "Hold your name close." It wasn't her real name written there anymore, not since that forged signature, but she touched it anyway and whispered the truth to the dark. Outside, a horse stamped once, then stilled. The air cooled fast after sunset. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and let her eyes fall closed. At the edge of sleep, the night cracked open. The faint rhythm of hoofbeats just beyond the gate, slow and deliberate, circling once before fading into the hills. Clara's eyes snapped open. She lay still, heart climbing into her throat. No one else seemed to hear. Morning would tell whether it had been a dream or a warning. The rain came sudden that night, the first in months. It struck the tin roof like 1,000 coins thrown by God himself, and the smell of wet earth filled the house before Clara could even reach the window. The sky was low and bruised, the kind that promised both mercy and trouble. Malachi was still out in the corral, driving the cattle toward shelter. From the porch, she saw him through the sheets of rain, moving slow but sure, coat plastered to his back. Lightning split the ridge for a heartbeat, showing him wrestling a young steer away from the broken fence. "Fool man," she whispered, and ran for the door. By the time she reached the gate, her dress clung to her knees and her hair had come loose. Malachi caught the steer's halter, shoved the gate shut, and turned as she came through the mud. "You shouldn't be out here," he called. "You shouldn't either," she shot back, voice nearly lost to the storm. He laughed once, short and surprised, and together they coaxed the frightened animal back into the pen. When it was done, he leaned on the rail, rain running from the brim of his hat. She stepped closer, holding out a dry towel she'd snatched from the porch. "Here," she said. "You'll catch cold." He took it without protest, wiped his face, then draped it around her shoulders instead. "Looks like you need it worse." Something in the simple gesture caught her off guard. For a moment, the noise of the storm fell away. She saw his hands, scarred, rough from work, yet careful, and felt a warmth that didn't belong to the fire or the coat he'd given her before. They walked back to the house together, boots squelching through the soaked clay. Inside, the lamplight trembled with every gust. Clara poured hot water into a tin mug, dropped in a pinch of willow bark. "For pain," she murmured, offering it to him. He nodded, eyes soft. "Thank you, Miss Whitlow." "You could call me Clara." He hesitated, as if names carried weight. "Clara, then." They sat across from each other at the table, steam curling between them. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley like a restless god. For a long while, neither spoke. She watched the rain tracing lines down the window, each drop sliding into another, until there was no telling them apart. "I used to think storms meant something was being washed clean," she said. "Now I think they just remind you what still clings." Malachi's gaze didn't move from the glass. "Maybe both can be true." She wanted to tell him about the paper in her satchel, about Pike's whisper and the name she'd stolen to buy a dying man another month of breath. But when she opened her mouth, the words turned to ash. He looked at her then, steady, unreadable, and somehow she knew he wouldn't ask. He gave people the dignity of their silences. The fire sank low. He rose to add a log, his movements unhurried. "The creek's swelling," he said. "If it eats through the lower bank again, it'll take the corral." "Can it be fixed?" "Tomorrow. I'll build a wall of stone. Keep the water where it belongs." She nodded, understanding more than he meant. There was always something trying to wash away what you built, and someone stubborn enough to keep building. When the rain eased, he handed her his coat again before heading for the barn. "I'll check the horses." "You can wait till morning." He smiled faintly. Mornings don't stop floods. She watched him disappear into the dim blur beyond the porch. The storm had gentled to a whisper now, and the smell of rain on dust felt almost holy. In her room, she lit the small lamp, spread her wet shawl by the hearth, and sank onto the bed. Sleep came slow, haunted by the echo of hoofbeats from the night before. Somewhere between waking and dream, she thought she heard it again. A single horse passing near the creek, slow and deliberate, then gone. By dawn, the air was clear and silvered with mist. When she stepped outside, the world smelled of new beginnings. Then she saw them. Fresh hoofprints in the soft bank by the water, deeper and sharper than any of Malachi's horses would leave. Someone had been there. Close enough to see the window where she slept. By noon, the valley had dried again. The air turned sharp and electric from the night's storm. The grass still glistened under the sun, whispering faintly as the wind moved through it. From the porch, Clara watched Malachi and the Ortega brothers drive the herd across the open field, black, brown, and red hides shifting like a tide. It was work that smelled of sweat and grit and living. Malachi rode ahead, hat low against the glare. He moved as if the land itself knew him. Each motion measured, patient, calm. The sight of him out there filled Clara with something quiet and strong, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She had begun to see how silence could be its own kind of gentleness. She brought them water when the sun climbed high, balancing the tin pail against her hip. Luis waved her over, smiling through the dust. "Señorita, you bring the good kind, cold from the well." "Malachi's orders," she said, handing him a cup. Luis grinned. "Then the boss knows blessings." They laughed lightly, and for a moment it felt like the weight of crosswind had finally fallen off her shoulders. But then the wind changed, quick and dry, carrying a crack of static that made the cattle stir. Malachi's head snapped up. "Lightning," he said, voice low. A second later, the sky flashed white, though there was no cloud to birth it. The sound came not from above, but across the ridge. Thunder without rain. What the old ranchers called dry fire. The herd panicked, hooves pounding, the ground trembling under their weight. "Back!" Malachi shouted. "Keep them tight!" Santiago and Luis split left and right, trying to flank the surge. One steer, young and thick-horned, broke loose, eyes wide with fear, charging straight toward the fence. Malachi spurred his horse, cutting across its path. "Malachi, don't!" Clara cried, but the wind ate her voice. The steer hit him broadside. Horse and rider went down hard, a blur of dust and sound. The world held its breath. Then the herd thundered past, leaving only silence and the smell of hot earth. Clara ran, her skirt catching on dry thorns, lungs burning. She found him near the fence, one arm caught under the weight of the saddle, his breath coming ragged. "Malachi," she gasped, dropping to her knees. "I'm fine," he said, the word half swallowed by pain. She tugged the saddle free, hands shaking. His shirt was torn, dark with blood near the ribs. Luis came running with Doc Turner, who must have seen the commotion from the lower trail. Together they lifted Malachi onto a stretcher of canvas and hauled him toward the porch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and sweat. Doc Turner worked steady, his gray mustache twitching with concentration. "Cracked ribs. Nothing clean about it. He'll live, if he stays still." Malachi tried to speak, but Clara pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "Hush," she said softly. "You've done enough." He stared at her a moment. Something like gratitude or apology flickering in his eyes. "Don't cry for me," he murmured. "I'm not." But her voice broke anyway. Through the window, the sun leaned low, turning the fields to copper. She stayed by his bed until the others left, dipping a cloth into cool water, wiping the sweat from his temples. His breathing steadied, shallow but even. She felt her fear settle into something heavier, the quiet terror of almost losing what she didn't yet admit she'd found. When the doctor packed his bag, he nodded to her. "You'll keep him resting, miss?" "I will. And if he fights it, I'll make him rest harder." That pulled a faint smile from Malachi's cracked lips. Night came fast. The house sank into hush, broken only by the steady drip from the wash basin. Clara sat in the chair beside his bed, hands folded in her lap. Every so often, he stirred, muttering half words, and she leaned close, whispering that he was safe, that the storm had passed. When she went to fetch more water from the porch, a sound stopped her. The faint rustle of paper sliding under the front door. She bent down, heart already thudding. A sealed envelope lay on the floorboards. No name, just the smell of smoke and dust clinging to it. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single folded sheet and a smaller scrap of parchment. The words, written in a hand too neat to be honest, read, "A debt doesn't end with rain." The second paper was worse. A copy of the loan note she'd forged years ago. The name C. Whitman staring up at her like a wound reopened. Her hands went cold. Somewhere behind her, Malachi stirred in his sleep. She slipped the papers into her pocket before he could see, then blew out the lamp. The wind outside shifted again, and in its breath she could swear she heard a man's quiet laugh, fading toward the hills. The night didn't rest easy after that. The fire in the hearth had gone to ember, and every board in the house seemed to creak with a voice of its own. Clara sat on the floor beside Malachi's bed, the envelope still warm from her hands. She kept reading the words she wished she hadn't seen. A debt doesn't end with rain. Malachi slept uneasily, turning from side to side. Once his hand brushed hers, as if to make sure she was still there. She froze, torn between pulling away and staying. The choice lasted a second, then she stayed. Outside, a gust of wind lifted the porch dust like sighs. By dawn, his fever had broken. The first pale light slipped through the curtains, thin and cold. Clara slipped out quietly, the papers clutched tight in her apron pocket. She walked to the creek, its surface swollen and fast from last night's rain. She wanted to tear the letter, let the current take it. But her hands refused. The truth didn't float away so easily. Behind her, boots scuffed the dirt. "You're up early," Malachi's voice said. He leaned against the post, wrapped in a blanket, face drawn but steady. "You shouldn't be walking," she said. "I could say the same. You look like you fought a ghost and lost." She tried to smile. "Maybe I did." He studied her, eyes narrowing a little. "Someone left something under the door last night, didn't they?" Her pulse skipped. "Why do you think that?" "Because you've been holding your breath since dawn." For a moment she considered lying, but there was something in his gaze that made it impossible. Slowly, she reached into her apron and handed him the papers. He looked down at the faded ink, at the name she wasn't born with. "C. Whitman," he read quietly. "That you?" "Yes." Her voice cracked. "My father was dying. The banker wouldn't lend under my family's name. I thought I could buy him time. I bought his shame instead." He stood there for a long moment, neither pitying nor judging. Then he folded the papers and set them on the porch rail. "You're not the first to change a name to survive." "You're not angry?" she asked. "I'm angry at a world that made you do it." The words fell between them like a soft bell. She turned away before the tears could fall. Later that day, he sat on the porch while Luis and Santiago mended the corral. The smell of wet hay drifted through the air. Every now and then he winced when he breathed too deep, but he refused to rest. "Can't let them think I'm breakable," he said. Clara brought him water, shaking her head. "You're the most stubborn man I've met." He smiled faintly. "And you, the bravest woman I've known." She looked down, not trusting her voice. As the sun dipped low, a shadow appeared at the end of the road. Viola Temple, riding side saddle on her pale horse, a basket looped over one arm. She dismounted neatly, dress crisp as her smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Reed. Miss Whitlow." "Ma'am," Malachi said. Viola set the basket on the porch step. "Thought I'd bring a little comfort. Folks are talking again in town. You know how tongues work after rain." Her gaze slid to Clara. "A young woman living alone under a man's roof. Some might call that trouble." Clara straightened. "Then let them call it what they will." Viola's eyes softened just enough to sting. "I only worry for your soul, dear. Temptation's a tricky beast." She turned her horse and rode away, leaving the smell of lilac and disapproval in her wake. When the dust settled, Malachi looked at Clara. "You want me to take you back to town, if it makes it easier?" She met his gaze. "Would you want me to go?" He didn't answer, and that silence said more than any word could. That evening, Clara set the basket on the table. Inside were sweet biscuits and a folded note written in looping hand. "May the Lord guide you away from sin." Her jaw tightened. She crumpled the note, threw it into the fire, watched the flame catch and curl around it. Behind her, Malachi spoke softly. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand. Doesn't mean we have to." Clara turned to him, eyes bright with something between anger and relief. "Then what do we do?" "We keep building the wall," he said, "stone by stone." The lamplight flickered across the wooden box on the mantel, the same one he'd touched the day she arrived. He reached for it, fingers tracing the grain. "My mother kept her letters in here," he said quietly. "Never burned them, never hid them. Just proof that a person can walk through shame and still belong somewhere." Clara stood beside him. For the first time, she let herself breathe fully. But outside, just beyond the line of cottonwoods, a shape lingered, motionless, waiting. When lightning flashed across the far ridge, the glint of metal caught the light. A belt buckle, or maybe the edge of a revolver. The rain began again, soft but certain, tapping against the roof like a warning that hadn't finished speaking. The days stretched long after the rain, the fields drying under a pale sun that seemed to watch without warmth. Malachi's ribs were healing slow. He still moved with care, though he'd never admit it. Clara spent her mornings by the creek, washing clothes, eyes always glancing toward the tree line, where the unseen watcher might still linger. One afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Heavy, uneven, a tired gait. A lone rider came down the hill, hat pulled low, coat torn at the elbow. The man dismounted stiffly at the gate, staring at the house as though it were half a dream. "Clara?" he called, voice worn and uncertain. She froze, the bucket slipping from her hand. The sound of her name in that voice belonged to another life. Aaron. Her brother hadn't changed much, just hardened at the edges. His eyes were sharp, the kind that had seen too many nights behind saloon doors and too many mornings without forgiveness. He smiled, a little crooked. "You're still standing. That's something." Malachi came down the porch steps, boots steady, eyes measuring. "Friend of yours?" "My brother," Clara said quietly. "Aaron Whitlow." Aaron tipped his hat, studying the man before him. "So you're the one bought her freedom." The words carried no gratitude, only a strange curiosity. Malachi didn't flinch. "Paid a debt, that's all." They shook hands, the air between them taut as a stretched wire. Clara sensed what each man saw in the other: pride, caution, and a certain unspoken grief. That evening, they ate together, cornbread, stew, and silence. The lamp cast small halos on their faces. Aaron spoke of nothing for a while, then leaned back in his chair. "Didn't figure I'd find my sister living on a ranch run by a black man." The words hit like a spark on dry tinder. Luis looked up from his bowl, the spoon pausing mid-air. Malachi didn't move, only set his cup down, slow. "You figured wrong about a few things, Mr. Whitlow." Clara's heart clenched. "Aaron, please." "I meant no offense," Aaron said, but his tone betrayed the habit of prejudice more than the intent. "Just unexpected." Malachi stood. "Unexpected doesn't make it wrong." He gathered the dishes without looking at him, carried them to the basin, and began to wash. The sound of water filled the silence that followed. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Clara found Malachi on the porch, the night folded around him like a cloak. "I'm sorry," she said. "He didn't mean harm." "He meant what he was taught," Malachi replied. "That's a harder thing to unlearn than cruelty." She nodded, arms wrapped around herself. "He's all the family I have left." "Then he's worth forgiving," he said. "But not at the cost of who you are now." For a while they listened to the wind dragging through the cottonwoods. Then Malachi spoke again, quieter. "Your brother, he's hiding something. The way he rides, the way his eyes keep to the hills. He's been followed before." Clara frowned. "You think he's being hunted?" "Maybe not anymore. Or maybe the man following us found him first." That night, Aaron didn't sleep inside. He took a blanket and bedded down in the barn, saying the fresh air helped his lungs. But Clara knew better. She'd seen the revolver he kept near his hand, the one engraved with a pattern she recognized from wanted posters nailed to old station posts. Sometime after midnight, she woke to footsteps outside her window. Light, careful. She moved to the sill just in time to see Aaron slipping through the back gate, coat pulled tight, a shadow moving with him along the fence line. He didn't see her watching. The moon caught the edge of the other figure for only a breath. A woman's form in a dark cloak, her posture too refined for the night. Then both were gone, swallowed by the dark toward the northern pasture. When Clara told Malachi in the morning, his face hardened. "You sure what you saw?" "I'm sure. The woman, she looked like Viola Temple." He didn't curse, but the silence that followed was louder than anger. Luis came running from the barn then, holding a torn scrap of fabric he'd found snagged on the fence. It was black silk, the kind no ranch woman would ever wear to work. Malachi took it, turned it over once in his hand. "Looks like your brother brought more than family to our door." The sky that day stayed heavy with the threat of rain again. But the smell in the air wasn't weather. It was trouble. The storm never came that day, but the sky stayed bruised and low, as if it wanted to listen. Word reached Reed Homestead by noon, carried on the back of a mail rider too eager for gossip. Harlan Pike had filed a petition at the county courthouse. Charges of fraud and deception against Clara Whitlow, alias C. Whitman. Luis read the folded notice aloud on the porch, voice halting over the legal words. When he finished, no one spoke. The paper trembled slightly in Clara's hand. She could feel her own name, 2 names, burning through the ink. "They'll summon you to testify," Malachi said, his tone calm but tight. "We'll have time to prepare." Clara shook her head. "No, you don't understand. I forged that paper. I did sign that name." "Because you had to," Malachi said. "The law doesn't care why." Inside, the fire popped, throwing a flash of light over the walls. The house felt smaller suddenly. The walls too close, every breath thick with the memory of shame. By evening, the sky bled purple and red. Doc Turner arrived with a small envelope of his own. News from town. "They're calling for a hearing next week," he said, wiping his brow. "And Pike's stirring half the congregation against you. Viola Temple's been riding from house to house, preaching about sin and deceit." Clara gripped the doorframe. "She's doing this for him?" Doc sighed. "Maybe for herself. Maybe for the show of righteousness." Malachi's jaw clenched. "He's using her name to wash his hands in public." Doc nodded, weary. "Crosswind's always been hungry for scandal. Give it a scent, and it'll bite." After he left, silence returned like a tide. Clara stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the horizon. "He won't stop until he ruins me," she whispered. Malachi stepped closer, his voice low and even. "He's already ruined enough. Don't let him take the rest." She turned to face him. "What if he drags you down too?" He gave a small, tired smile. "Then I'll go down standing beside you." The words broke something inside her. Something she hadn't realized was still braced for loneliness. But before she could speak, Aaron slammed his fist against the table. "You don't get to play martyr, Reed. I brought her into this world. I'll get her out." "You brought trouble to this house," Malachi said, still calm. "And you'll fix it by standing with her, not running from it." Aaron stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, his shoulders sagging. "You think you know men like Pike?" He's got more snakes behind him than you can count. Luis appeared at the door then, holding a crumpled slip of paper he'd found wedged under the barn door. "Found this," he said quietly. Malachi took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp and familiar, Viola's. "The truth will find its light in court. Crosswind cannot be cleansed while sin sleeps in its fields." At the bottom was a list of signatures, dozens of names from the church congregation, calling for restoration of moral order. Clara's breath hitched. "She's turned them all against us." Malachi folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the pocket of his coat. "Then we find truth louder than her prayers." That night, the ranch felt hollow. The Ortega brothers locked the barn tight, and Aaron paced the porch like a restless shadow. Malachi sat at the table, sorting through the old account ledgers, searching for any record that might prove Pike's fraud. Clara watched him from the doorway, her heart torn between fear and gratitude. At last he looked up. "You could run, Clara. Take the money, go south to Santa Fe, start over." She shook her head. "And live like a ghost again?" "No, I'm done running." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Malachi nodded, as if something had settled inside him. "Then we stand." Lightning flashed far off in the hills, dry, soundless, but bright enough to cast the room in silver. Clara crossed to the table, her hand brushing his as she sat. "How do we fight men who own the truth?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes steady. "We make them look in a mirror." In the barn, Aaron searched through his saddlebag, fingers finding a folded receipt written in English and poor arithmetic. The ink was smudged, the numbers uneven. He squinted, realizing what he held. "Pike's handwriting," he whispered, "and the same trick he used on our father." The night wind rose, cold and certain. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called. A long, low sound that ended before the echo returned. Aaron tucked the paper into his coat and stepped into the darkness toward the house. He didn't see the shadow detach itself from the fence line, nor the faint metallic glint that followed as he disappeared inside. The morning after Aaron's discovery came cold and windless, the kind of day when sound carried too far. A pale fog lay over the fields, and even the horses seemed to move quieter than usual. Clara brewed coffee strong enough to burn, trying to shake the heaviness that had settled over the house since the night before. Malachi sat at the table, the crumpled receipt spread out before him. He traced the uneven lines of ink with one finger. "He overcharged the Ortega family threefold," he said, voice low. "Same handwriting, same terms. If we can show that to the court, it proves a pattern." Luis nodded grimly. "He signed half this town into debt. We just never saw it written plain." Aaron leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "If we go to court with that, Pike will bring every man he's bought to swear against you." "Then we'll need more than words," Malachi replied. "We'll need records." For the next 2 days, the ranch turned into a quiet workshop of truth. Luis and Santiago rode to old ranches, gathering notes and letters Pike had left in his wake. Doc Turner searched his office for the file on Clara's father. proof that the debt had been repaid before Pike falsified it again. Clara spent hours in the loft, sorting through ledgers, copying statements by lamplight until her fingers cramped. Once she looked up to see Malachi watching her from the doorway. He didn't speak, only offered a faint smile, the kind that held her together when exhaustion threatened to pull her apart. "You don't have to do all this," she whispered. "Yes, I do," he said, "because you're not the only one he cheated." Outside, the air grew heavy again with the smell of coming rain. Aaron sat sharpening his knife by the porch rail, restless. "You sure about standing up there?" he asked Malachi that evening. "They'll eat you alive in that courthouse." Malachi's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Then they'll know I was there." When night came, Clara found him inside, practicing what he might say. He stood before the small mirror above the mantel, speaking softly to his own reflection. "I don't ask the court for mercy," he murmured, "only for measure." His voice was steady, the words plain. She watched in silence, her chest tight with pride and dread. Later, as they cleaned the table, she spoke first. "I keep thinking if I hadn't forged that paper, none of this would have happened." He turned to her. "If you hadn't, your father would have died alone. You paid a price for love, Clara. That's not sin. That's survival." Her throat trembled. "And if the court won't see it that way, then they'll see a woman who stands her ground." Aaron entered then, holding a stack of papers bound with twine. "Here, letters from other ranchers, all signed by Pike himself. They'll nail his coffin shut." Malachi took them carefully, his expression unreadable. "This will help." Clara placed a hand over his. "Will it be enough?" "Truth rarely is," he said softly, "but it's what we've got." That night, before sleep, Clara opened the wooden box on the mantel. Inside, beneath a small piece of cloth, lay a folded note in delicate handwriting. Malachi's mother's hand, she guessed. "Freedom is the name a person gives themselves." She read it again and again until her vision blurred. It was both a comfort and a charge. When the first light came, Aaron hitched the wagon. Luis loaded a basket of food for the road. Malachi dressed in his cleanest shirt, buttoning it slow, careful. Around his neck, he fastened a silver chain. Simple, engraved with the letter M. "My mother's," he said quietly. "Reminds me not to forget who I am when they try to tell me otherwise." Clara adjusted his collar, fingers brushing the warm metal. "Then we'll go in as who we are," she said, her voice barely more than breath. He met her gaze. "Together, then. Together." As they climbed into the wagon, a thin drizzle began to fall, gentle, persistent. The world smelled of earth and iron. Behind them, the ranch stood small and still, its windows catching the morning light like the eyes of something alive, watching them leave. The horses started forward. The road to Crosswind stretched gray and endless before them. Each turn of the wheel sounded like a clock, counting down to reckoning. From the ridge behind, a lone rider appeared for a moment. a dark shape against the pale sky, then vanished into the mist. The courthouse in Crosswind sat square at the end of Main Street, its stone walls stained with dust and years of arguments. When the wagon stopped, the town was already gathered outside, faces she knew once by name, now sharp with judgment. The church bell tolled once, as if to bless or condemn what was about to unfold. Clara stepped down first, skirts brushing against the dry earth. Her legs trembled, but she lifted her chin. Malachi followed, his black coat clean, hat in hand. The crowd parted for him in uneasy silence. A few men muttered beneath their breath. One spat near his boot. He didn't look their way. Inside, the room was crowded, the air thick with sweat and perfume. Judge Holloway, a narrow man with a voice like creaking timber, adjusted his spectacles. "We are here to hear the case of Harlan Pike versus Clara Whitlow," he announced. Pike stood near the front, dressed fine, his smile too smooth. At his side sat Viola Temple, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with purpose. She looked almost saintly under the lamplight, and that made Clara's stomach twist. The proceedings began. Pike's lawyer read from the forged note, the one bearing the name C. Whitman. His words dripped with false righteousness. "She deceived the bank," he said, "used another name to hide her father's debts, and now seeks to profit from lies, sheltering under the roof of the man who paid her ransom." The crowd murmured. Clara's fingers knotted together in her lap. Malachi sat beside her, silent, still as stone. When the judge called her forward, her knees wavered, but she stood. The sound of her shoes on the floor was louder than any heartbeat. "Miss Whitlow," the judge said, "do you admit to signing this document under a false name?" She looked straight ahead. "Yes." The room hissed with whispers. Pike's grin widened, his satisfaction too quick. "Time 500s. But," she said, voice trembling, "I did it because my father was dying. I went to Pike for a loan under our name, but he refused, unless I signed another. He said a woman's word wasn't good enough, so I made it good enough myself. I lied to save a life." Someone in the crowd muttered, "Liar still." But no one laughed this time. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "You understand that's still forgery, Miss Whitlow?" "Yes," she said, "but I understand something else now. There are worse things than breaking a law written by men who never had to beg." Malachi rose then. "Your Honor," he said, his voice filling the room, "I'll speak." The judge frowned. "You are not counsel." "I'm her witness," Malachi said, "and a man whose family once lived under laws that called them property. I know what it is to be written wrong." He reached into his coat and set the wooden box on the table. "This belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She kept letters in it, proof of the names she was called before she earned her own. Freedom isn't a favor. It's something you hold until someone tries to take it back." He opened the box. Inside were the receipts, Pike's handwriting, the false ledgers, and the doctor's record of Clara's father repaying his debt. "This is the truth you've been asking for," he said, laying them before the judge. The room went still. Pike's face drained of color. Viola turned pale as parchment. Doc Turner stepped forward next. "I can swear to those numbers," he said. Pike charged double interest, falsified signatures, including mine. He preyed on grief. The judge read the documents for a long time. The ticking of the clock filled every corner. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. "Miss Whitlow, you did wrong, but under duress. The law will fine you for false signature, but the greater wrong lies elsewhere." He turned to Pike. "Mr. Pike, your claim is dismissed. The court will be reviewing your records. If fraud is proven, you'll answer for it." The gavel came down. The sound cracked the air clean. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a murmur swept through the crowd. Not anger this time, but something like disbelief. Pike staggered back, caught between outrage and shame. Viola rose, face white, and walked toward the door without a word. Clara stood, the weight in her chest finally breaking. Malachi reached for her hand, a simple touch that steadied the whole world. Outside, the sunlight hit her face like grace. People stared but didn't speak. Even those who had judged her now looked away, unsure of their footing. On the courthouse steps, Malachi let go of her hand. "It's done," he said. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not until we live past it." Down the street, children were laughing by the churchyard, chasing a paper hoop through the dust. Viola Temple paused there, watching them. Something in her expression wavered, a faint, fleeting crack in the stone of her composure, before she turned and walked away. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that never quite came. And for the first time in years, Crosswind felt quiet. The storm that had hovered for days never broke hard. It simply softened. By the time the wagon rolled back through the open gate of Reed Homestead, the air was cool and silver, the kind of quiet that only comes after a reckoning. Dust had turned to mud, the smell of wet sage rising like incense. Everything looked washed, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. Clara stepped down first. Her boots sank into the damp ground, and the chill went up through her bones, steady and real. Behind her, Malachi tied off the horses and paused a long moment, his hand resting on the bridle. He didn't speak, but the weight of what had happened in that courtroom hung between them like smoke that wouldn't quite clear. She turned to him. "It feels strange," she said softly. "Winning, I mean. I thought it would feel like breathing again." Malachi glanced toward the distant hills. "Freedom never feels light, Clara. It just stops being heavy." They unloaded the wagon together, papers, the wooden box, what little they had carried, and walked the path down toward the creek. The stream ran higher than usual from the week's rain, cutting clear and cold over smooth stones. Wild cottonwoods bent over the water, their leaves trembling even in the still air. Clara sat on a flat rock near the edge. For the first time in months, she wasn't being watched, judged, or bartered. The silence was almost frightening. I keep thinking of all the faces at the courthouse, she said. How they looked at you when you spoke, like they were hearing something they didn't want to understand. They were, Malachi said simply. Truth doesn't sit easy with people who've never had to live under someone else's thumb. She watched him crouch by the water, washing his hands clean of the dust. He looked tired, but peaceful in a way she hadn't seen before, like a man who had finally put down a long burden. When he stood, he reached into his pocket and drew something out. A small silver chain, old and dull, the letter M engraved near the clasp. The metal caught the thin light of evening, flickering faintly like a promise. My mother's, he said. She wore it when she worked the fields, said it reminded her she belonged to no one. Clara looked at the way his fingers curled around it, as if it still carried her pulse. She must have been brave, she murmured. She was tired, he said, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. But that's what courage looks like most days. He stepped closer, holding the chain out to her. I want you to have it. She blinked, startled. I can't take that. It's part of her. Malachi shook his head. She used to say love isn't ownership. It's walking beside someone until the road divides, and still wishing them sunlight. I think she'd want you to carry that kind of freedom. Clara hesitated, her throat tightening. And what about you? What do you carry now? He looked down at her, rain still clinging to the brim of his hat. You, he said, quiet but certain. If you'll let me. The words slipped into the air between them, simple and unadorned, and yet they hung there like something sacred. Clara couldn't answer right away. She just looked at him. The steadiness of his eyes, the gentleness of his hands that had held a gun, a plow, her life, and she felt something inside her unclench at last. Then stay, she said. Walk beside me as far as the road goes. Her hands trembled as she reached for the chain. Instead of wearing it around her neck, she looped it twice around her wrist. Closer to the work, she said, smiling faintly. Malachi nodded, eyes bright with quiet pride. Looks better there anyway. They sat that way for a while, letting the silence do the talking. The sound of the water was steady, rhythmic, a heartbeat in the land itself. Somewhere upstream, a meadowlark began to sing, its notes light as dust rising in sunlight. I've been thinking, Clara said after a time, about what comes next. He raised an eyebrow. Next? I want to start a school. Nothing grand. Just here, by the creek maybe. For the children who can't make it to town. The Diaz boys. The little ones from the mining camp. Whoever wants to learn. Malachi tilted his head, watching her. You miss teaching. She smiled sadly. I miss believing that words can make a life better. My father used to say, knowledge is the only inheritance worth fighting for. Maybe that's something I can still give. He nodded slowly, as though he'd been waiting for her to say it. Then we'll build it. A room by the water, windows wide enough for light to come through, even on bad days. You make it sound simple, she teased. He grinned, the first real grin she'd seen in weeks. Simple's just what's left after you tell the truth long enough. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet grass and horses from the far paddock. Malachi stood and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her gently to her feet. For a moment they just stood there, close enough that she could hear his breath steady and slow. You ever think about leaving this place? She asked. Once, he admitted. Before you came. Thought maybe freedom was somewhere else. Turns out, it was just waiting for me to stop running. She smiled, tears burning behind her eyes. Then maybe we both stopped in the same place for a reason. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. Maybe so. The clouds broke just enough for sunlight to spill across the valley, catching on the flooded grass and turning it gold. Clara's eyes shone like the water, full of something between sorrow and joy. Malachi, she whispered, do you ever wonder if we deserve this peace? He shook his head gently. You don't earn peace, you just don't waste it when it comes. She leaned forward then, resting her forehead against his chest. The smell of leather and rain and earth filled her senses. For the first time, she let herself cry without shame, not the sharp tears of fear or loss, but the deep, quiet ones that come when a long hunger finally ends. His arms came around her, slow and careful, like he was holding something too precious to name. It's all right, he murmured. You're home. When she finally looked up, her lashes were wet, but her eyes were calm. Then we'll build that school, she said, half laughing through the remnants of tears. And I'll dig the foundation myself, he answered. Ain't much I can teach, but I can make a place for teaching. As they turned back toward the house, the sound of footsteps came faintly from the ridge. They looked up to see Aaron, her brother, walking slowly down the slope, carrying a bundle of freshly cut cedar. The boards were stacked across his shoulder, rough but straight. He raised a hand in greeting. Figured you might need some lumber, he called out. Clara's laugh carried over the field. For the school? Aaron shrugged. Or a porch swing. Depends what you're building first. Malachi smiled, quiet approval in his eyes. Looks like he plans on staying a while. Maybe, Clara said, watching her brother's steady gait. Maybe he's tired of running too. They met him halfway. Aaron set the wood down with a grunt, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. I'll start cutting tomorrow. We can put the posts near the willow line. Ground's firm there. Sounds good, Malachi said. Aaron hesitated, then looked at Clara. You sure this is what you want, Bee? Clara nodded. I'm sure. For the first time in my life, I'm sure. Her brother's gaze softened. Then I'll help you build it. The three of them stood in silence, the creek murmuring behind them, the ranch stretching wide under the afternoon sun. The sky was still bruised with the remnants of storm, but the light had a warmth to it now, as if the world had decided to forgive itself. As the day faded, Clara and Malachi walked back to the porch. The air smelled of damp pine and wood smoke. She paused at the door, looking out over the field where Aaron stacked the cedar. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, "for something good to last here?" Malachi came to stand beside her. "Only if we build it like we mean to stay." The wind moved through the grass again, slow and low. Clara reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together without thought. For once there was no need for words, only the quiet certainty of shared breath and the soft gleam of the silver chain at her wrist, catching the last light of day. Behind them, the fire inside the house flickered alive, chasing the gray from the walls. In its glow, the wooden box still rested on the mantel, open, empty, ready to hold something new. Outside, the meadowlark sang once more, its song falling like a prayer over the ranch, the creek, the broken and mended hearts that now beat in rhythm with the land itself. Spring came slow to Crosswind, cautious as a child learning to trust again. The storms were gone, leaving the air clean and bright, the land tender with green. Every blade of grass shimmered like something reborn. At Reed Homestead, the new schoolhouse stood ready. A one-room cabin built from cedar, its windows wide, a bell hung from an old rail spike. The smell of chalk mixed with sawdust and sun. Clara ran her hand over the smooth table Luis had carved, then stepped outside to breathe the morning air. The children were coming. She heard them before she saw them, shoes crunching gravel, laughter spilling like water. The Diaz boys carried beans as a gift. Little Rosa clutched wildflowers tied with a string. Even the shy ones smiled when they saw her. Malachi stood by the fence, hat low, watching them with quiet pride. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "You built half the walls," Clara answered. He smiled. "You built the reason." When the bell rang for the first time, its soft tone carried over the fields. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows, painting the wooden floor with gold. Clara wrote "Freedom" on the blackboard. The children repeated the letters in clumsy voices, and she felt something swell inside her chest. A peace that wasn't borrowed from anyone. By noon, laughter echoed from the yard. Mama Ortega served stew and bread. Aaron leaned against the well, pretending not to smile as the children praised his benches. "They'll hold 100 years," he said gruffly, though his eyes glimmered with pride. As the sun lowered, Clara dismissed the class. The families drifted home, their voices fading into the quiet. She stayed behind to tidy the desks. The room was small, but it already smelled like purpose, chalk, warm bread, and hope. She stepped outside and saw Malachi mending the fence by the creek. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled high. The light touched his face in soft gold. "You'll work yourself to the bone," she teased. He looked up and grinned. "And you'll teach till dark. We're both guilty." The moment lingered, easy and sweet. The peace between them was no longer fragile. It was earned. A distant figure appeared on the road. A rider, moving slow. When the horse came close enough, she recognized Viola Temple. The woman's dress was travel-worn, her gloves dusty. A basket hung from her arm. Clara met her halfway across the yard. The two women stood facing each other, the wind tugging gently at their hair. "I heard about your school," Viola said quietly. "It's small," Clara replied, "but it's a start." Viola's eyes flickered toward the building. "Sometimes one room is all a town needs to remember itself." She held out the basket. "Sweet rolls, for the children." Clara accepted it with care. "Thank you." Viola hesitated. "I won't pretend I came to ask forgiveness. I don't have the words, but when I rode past and heard them laughing, well, it sounded better than the sermons I've been preaching." Clara's throat tightened. "You're welcome here if you ever want to listen again." A faint smile touched Viola's lips. "Maybe one day," she said, "when the town forgets who I was." She turned her horse and rode away slowly. Clara stood watching until the dust settled. When she looked down, she found a folded note tucked under the basket's handle. It read, "Children learning letters. Oh, what music. May it never stop. No name, no apology. Just that." Malachi came up beside her, his hands still dusty from work. "She was here," he said. Clara nodded. "She didn't say sorry. She didn't need to." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing the silver chain around her wrist. "Some debts aren't meant to be paid in words," he said. "Only in what comes after." They walked toward the porch. Aaron sat carving a small wooden bird, the chips falling like curled petals. When Rosa ran past, he handed it to her with an awkward smile. "For the best student," he said. She giggled and ran back toward the schoolhouse, clutching it like treasure. Clara leaned against the railing, looking out across the field. The land was alive again. Grass swaying, fences shining faint in the last light. "You think it'll last?" she asked. Malachi followed her gaze. "If we keep tending it. Peace is just another kind of field." As dusk deepened, they stepped inside. The wooden box still rested on the mantel, open, filled now with the children's first letters, uneven handwriting, misspelled words, bright dreams. Clara traced one page lightly. "I want to be good." It was signed by Rosa, the smallest. Malachi came behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Looks like you've started something that'll outlive all of us," he said. "Maybe," she whispered. "But even if it doesn't, it's enough that it started." He kissed her temple, soft as a breath. "That's all a life ever needs." Outside, the windmill creaked. The bell above the school swayed once, low, mellow, like the land itself humming a lullaby. Later, under the pale moon, they sat together on the porch steps. Clara rested her head on Malachi's shoulder, watching the horizon fade into silver mist. "I used to think peace had to be earned," she said quietly. Malachi smiled. "No. Peace is what's left when you stop apologizing for living." She closed her eyes, her hand resting over the chain at her wrist. "Then I won't apologize again." The stars brightened above the cottonwoods. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark began to sing, and as its song rose over the land, Crosswind seemed, for the first time in years, to listen without judgment, only stillness, only grace. When the dust settles over Crosswind and the sun sinks low behind the cottonwoods, what remains isn't the pain or the judgment or even the debt. It's the quiet proof that love, patience, and kindness still take root, even in the hardest soil. Clara and Malachi found what so many of us still hope to find: a peace that doesn't come from winning, but from understanding. A home built not from boards and nails, but from forgiveness, work, and gentle words shared over a simple supper. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a longing, a reminder of how courage once felt, tell us what it brought back in the comments. Your stories keep this little corner of the Old West alive. To walk more trails like this, where hearts heal slow and hope still rides under wide skies. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next ride. Until then, friends, keep the lamp lit and let your hearts stay warm beneath the western stars.